I remember back in 2010 when we were filming our series Metal Evolution, in our episode about grunge, I had the opportunity to go to the studio of the legendary Steve Albini, rest in peace. And my memory of being there with Steve was first legendary studio. Steve was super gracious, funny, that kind of slightly jagged sense of humor that he brought to everything he did. And, you know, he was great. We really dug into the whole conversation about the relationship between punk and grunge and metal, which was really what that episode was about. And, you know, like everything with Steve, he had lots to say. He spoke his mind. And yeah, just wanted to share this clip with you as an homage to Steve Albini. Steve Albini, take one.
I want to ask you about this music called grunge. I talked with many people about it, Alice in Chains guys, on my way to speak with Kim Thale and spoken to some others about it. To what extent, in your view, was it an evolution of punk music?
All of the bands that were sort of critically referred to as grunge bands were part of a spectrum of underground bands that was an outgrowth of the punk idiom. In particular, all the bands from Seattle and the Northwest were all inspired by Midwestern bands like Killdozer and other sort of atypical or asymmetrical punk bands. And it's grouped in with heavy metal a lot, and I think that there is some sort of latent metal DNA in anybody who was a rock music fan before there was punk rock, or even came into punk rock from a place that was geographically isolated from the centers of punk activity. So before there was punk rock, or before certain populations had been inoculated with punk rock, there was certainly an interest in heavy metal and hard rock. And then as the underground music scene sort of expanded and it spread tendrils everywhere, and hometown bands would leave and go on tour and run into other bands out of town, or touring bands would come through town. And as the audience was built that way, then there was a kind of a natural progression for people who had developed a skill set while they were still into heavy metal, but were playing music that was more abstract and more, you know, thuggish and uglier.
Yeah, and what elements of that grunge sound do you think were distinctly not metal? Like, what were the aspects of that music that were definitely not borrowing from this music we call metal?
Right. Well, the heavy metal tradition had always had a kind of emphasis on virtuosity, on sort of vulgar exhibitionist musical tendencies, you know, long guitar solos, mammoth drum kits, or, you know, singer with a codpiece, shit like that. So there was always a kind of flamboyance, almost a camp element to heavy metal. The bands that grew out of the punk scene that were lumped in together as grunge bands were all much more straightforward in their presentation. They were street clothes, normal, regular people. Subject matter tended to be like much more frank, much more literal. And in a lot of cases, the musicianship was not necessarily, rudimentary is the wrong way to put it, but not academic and not necessarily bound by tradition and not necessarily display caliber musicianship. It was functional musicianship. You know, there would be a great drummer in a band like Killdozer, for example. He was great in the music that Killdozer played. If he were transported from that band to another band and asked to play in a different style, he probably wouldn't have been that great. But functionally, he was fantastic, you know. So I think those are pretty big distinctions between that music, that kind of 90s, late 80s, early 90s underground music, and conventional, traditional heavy metal.
So inversely then, back to the punk thing, I guess, those aspects that you're mentioning, whether it's the lack of spectacle, you know, that kind of, as you said, rudimentary is the wrong word, but that kind of stripped down approach, I suppose. Those you see are elements that are coming from punk music or from somewhere that's far away from what heavy metal represents.
I think the sort of workmanlike attitude and the lack of ostentation and the lack of show business came partly from the punk notion of making do with what you have organically, and partly from the fact that this is not music that came from a show business tradition. It's a music that came from a hanging out with your friends tradition. And when you're hanging out with your friends, when you're smoking weed and listening to records and like just being an asshole with your friends, you don't dress up to do it, you know, and you don't adopt an accent, and you don't put on airs when you're hanging out with your friends or cruising around in a car or looking for trouble. That's the social aspect of being in a band was a pretty significant factor in the makeup of all of these bands and in the function of all these bands.
And zeroing in specifically on Nirvana, what in your opinion makes Nirvana not part of the evolution or the tradition of heavy metal, in your opinion?
They do kind of exemplify this sort of plain-spoken, unpretentious presentation of music and sort of workmanlike arrangements and like lack of ornamentation, right? So I think they have a lot of the characteristics of a lot of the bands that I'm describing. And I know culturally that they identified with the underground primarily. Like all of their friends and peers were in underground or punk rock bands. And all of the people that they sort of developed their aesthetic with, like all their friends, were in bands of that ilk. So I don't think that they identified with heavy metal. Everything about the band was sort of functional, you know. There wasn't a wall of Marshall amplifiers. There was a Fender amp with a couple of broken tubes. There wasn't a massive drum kit with rototoms and a gong. There was a four-piece kit, you know. There wasn't, you know, a fireworks show. It was just three guys in dungarees and sweaters playing their songs. And I think all of that is much more in keeping with this underground band, independent band tradition or identity than with the sort of fanciful nature of a lot of heavy metal. Like a lot of heavy metal identified or evoked like the macabre and the metaphysical and in a way a kind of an ancient quality, right? Like dark oak beams with a coat of arms and, you know, a bloody skull somewhere, shit like that. And Nirvana and all their kindred bands, I think their environment was less of a hunting lodge and more of a basement, you know, more of like a carpeted basement with a television that didn't necessarily tune properly and, you know, your buddy's thrashed Volkswagen. Like that's the environment where that stuff came from.
I mean, it's a bit of a tired question, I suppose, and it's been asked before, but I'm interested to hear your perspective on it. Was this music in any way a reaction or the antithesis or an antidote to that whole movement?
On the West Coast and the Northwest specifically, a lot of the LA glam and hair bands made occasional forays up the coast to try to like whip up an audience in different places. And they may have met some reception some places, but I know for a fact that all the bands that we're discussing typically hated that music and those people and thought they were comical. I mean, people who are more entrenched in the punk scene and who came from an earlier punk lineage, all that Hairspray music was just a total fucking joke to us. Like that was music for retards, you know. There was some cross-pollination in the sense that some people moved from one camp to another as they matured, as their tastes matured. Like they might have been into some of that stuff early on, and then like as their aesthetic developed, they moved more into the punk camp or the underground camp or whatever. Mm-hmm. And then there was some sort of retrograde crossover in that, like, people would move to LA and find that the only people that wanted to play with them wanted to play music like that, so they ended up having to play music like that, you know, ended up having to play hair metal just because that's what, you know, you put an ad in the paper looking for a drummer, and the only drummers that would show up wearing, you know, fishnets and a foot-tall pompadour. And I mean, I know that happened to a couple of people. Yeah. I know that the punk and underground bands didn't identify with that Hairspray scene at all. Yeah. But that doesn't mean that there wasn't some interaction somewhere, sure. You know. And some people may have even gone poaching at the venues that had that kind of music because that's where the loose women were, you know.
You said something in your chat with our researcher Martin that I thought was really interesting. I'd love for you to talk about here. Is that you compared, when we look at the production or the sound of those two movements, scenes, whatever we want to call them, you called the grunge sound a documentary sound and the hair metal sound a Spielberg sound. Yeah, and I thought that was an interesting comparison. So could you speak to sonically how these two movements were different?
Well, I think everything about the LA glam Hairspray type scene, all that fishnets, Aquanet kind of stuff, that was entirely about a facade. It was all about a phony presentation, right? Dude isn't actually that tall, he's wearing platforms. Dude isn't actually cute, he's wearing a lot of makeup, you know. And that carried over into the sound of their records. The instruments never sounded organic on those records. And it was never the sound of a four-piece band. It was always like 30 vocalists layered on top of each other with a bunch of extra guitars and instruments and occasionally keyboards. And a lot of times the drums were replaced by drum machine samples or augmented with the, you know, kind of the machine that makes the drums sound like a hurricane, that kind of thing. And the bands from the underground, the independent rock, punk tradition bands, were much more interested in having their records represent them sort of legitimately, in a sort of a documentary sense. I mean, you could say it was the difference between like a Spielberg CGI type movie production and a kind of Blair Witch Project, one camera, homemade production for the two camps. It's obviously much less expensive to make a very stripped down, straightforward recording than it is to make a fancy, like, hyped up studio recording. But also you get a better idea what the band is actually like. And I think that was much more important to the independent bands than the heavy metal bands, like the categorical like hair metal bands. The hair metal bands wanted to be thought of as rock stars, and they wanted to be part of a spectacle. The underground bands wanted to be in a great band, and they wanted people to recognize that they were great bands, not trick people into thinking temporarily they were great bands so that they could get laid or extra money or something like that. They wanted to actually be great. So they spent a lot more time playing shows, working on their music, getting the identity of the band together than the sort of more experiential hair metal bands who were more about the party, more about the image, more about, you know, like living the lifestyle of a rock star. For a while there was like, it seemed like all those like heavy metal, like those hair metal and hard rock records, like it seemed like every sound on them was some kind of a weird stylized blip that wasn't a conventional sound. Like if you tried to play guitar so that it would sound like the guitars on those records, it would be impossible, right? And if you played the actual drums, they would never sound like that. It would always, you know, those records always had this weird like beer commercial quality where it was like, it was so removed from the experience. If you have any experience playing in a rock band or seeing a rock band live, those hair band records were always so far removed from that it was like, it was really uncomfortable. It was like watching it was like a real doll or something, you know? It was like a synthesis of an experience and not an actual experience.
It's interesting. I mean, the way you're defining it, I think, is interesting. I think if you could sum it up, it would be something like, you know, whether it was the sound or the look or whether it was the hunting lodge, it was larger than life, right? This idea that it could be larger than life. Whereas, in general, the picture you're painting of what came out of Seattle, whatever we want to call it, was not about being larger than life.
Yeah, no, all of the bands in the underground scene were all very fraternal. Like, you could go from Washington, D.C. to Chicago to Minneapolis to Seattle to Texas, and in all of those places, everybody had everybody else's phone numbers. Everybody sort of relied on each other for getting the straight dope about who was reliable in different cities, and you know all that. It was a very fraternal, very helpful network of people involved in that scene. And I got the impression that in the heavy metal scene it was much more competitive, much more cutthroat. People had managers and lawyers doing business on their behalf. They had there were a lot of things about the bands that were kind of, there was a veneer of professionalism between the members of the band, the actual people that were playing on stage, and the rest of the world. And if punk rock had any influence on that era, the underground music of that era, it was to remove all of those veneers, like to strip everything down to the point where you could walk up to the singer of your favorite band and say, "Hey, how you doing?" Where you could get the phone number of any musician that you admired and call him up and see if he could come play in your town, that kind of thing. It was a much more matter of fact, much more personal relationships developed, right? And to the extent that like earlier hard rock and heavy metal bands appealed to these bands, these grunge bands in finger quotes, and on that point, a friend of mine who lived in Seattle, Tim Midgett, from the band Silkworm, invented something that I think is quite useful, which is when you want to use finger quotes, but you want a little bit of extra irony, just stick another finger in there, right? So these grunge bands of the era, they identified with the simpler, more stripped-down heavy metal and hard rock, with things like Black Sabbath and AC/DC, like rudimentary music, thuggish music, ugly music that on its own merits was creepy and weird and uncomfortable, as opposed to the hair metal bands whose music always seemed to be trying to synthesize the atmosphere of a party, right? Yeah. Now there was partying, there was, if we can use party as a verb, there were elements of party in this underground scene, in this grunge scene, but it was less flamboyant, and it was more like hanging out with your friends, you know, having an interaction with people, as opposed to like driving around in a convertible, getting your dick sucked while you know, poured champagne on somebody, you know, that kind of thing.
Coming back to the bands themselves, and I know you said you're not an expert, but your observations on Nirvana, I think, are very helpful. I mean, if we start to compare Nirvana with other bands who emerged at that time, who came out of the same scene, particularly I'm thinking a band like Pearl Jam and Alice in Chains, even if they did not necessarily come directly out of the lineage of heavy metal, there seemed to be a sense with those bands that there was some striving for commerciality, striving for some level of stadiumness. Well, whereas Nirvana, it seemed, I guess what's emerging in my conversations with people is that Nirvana particularly seemed to be coming from a different place than Alice in Chains and Pearl Jam, say.
I don't know anything about Alice in Chains.
Right.
Okay, I will cop to complete ignorance about Alice in Chains. But I know that Pearl Jam was a kind of an assembled band of individual players that had business connections before they had a record or an audience, right? So that is about as far away from the organic development of a band that Nirvana had, where it was some friends from high school that hung out together and were fans of the Melvins and started a band so that they could play music like their friends and heroes, and then integrated themselves into a fraternal community of musicians and became part of that community of musicians. The Pearl Jam thing was a band was kind of assembled and insinuated into the professional stratum of the music scene by professionals, you know, the contingent of managers and booking agents and lawyers and record people. So there really is no relationship between the two. I mean, there's no more relationship between those two than there is between, say, a local church choir, which is people that happen to be in a church all singing together, and the backing singers for Miley Cyrus, who are all hired by, you know, to fulfill a contract, right? That's how different the worlds are, right? That they were lumped together by the ignorant mainstream public says more about the mechanics of publicity and the music industry's ability to position artists than it does about anything culturally about the relationship between Pearl Jam and Nirvana. Like you literally couldn't find a better example of bands that were from opposite ends of the cultural spectrum. Now, some of the musicians in Pearl Jam had a lineage that included some of these like roots in this underground scene, right? And I'm not casting aspersions on them individually. I'm just saying that the nature of the band and the way the band was sort of presented to the listening public was from the show business and professionalism end of the spectrum, and not from the organic basement party, you know, play gigs at the local tavern, tour on your own dime kind of tradition, which the punk tradition, which is where Nirvana came from.
Interesting.
I hope you're not offended that I say Nirvana instead of Nirvana. That's the U.S. pronunciation.
No, and I do. This is like the, you know, everything goes up to 11. This is sort of like our quotations go up to 3.
Right.
I think that's really, really cool. Is it fair to say, do you think then, just on a pure aspiration, it's interesting how you're defining metal, and I think it's really helpful, because you're defining metal not strictly in terms of the sound, which is similar to the way we're approaching it too. It's sort of, it's broader than that. It's about a look, it's about a presentation, it's also about aspiration and all these different elements. So do you think, just on a purely observational level, does it seem as though the aspirations of a band like Nirvana were different than, say, a band like Pearl Jam? And I ask that because, you know, there was always something to me growing up that seemed like Pearl Jam was sort of stadium ready. I mean, this is music that you can throw in a stadium and everyone's gonna kind of respond just like they might have been in a Van Halen concert. But with Nirvana, it seemed different.
Nirvana basically wanted to be a band. They wanted to function as a band, write songs, make records, do tours, and however much audience they garnered along the way was fine with them. They were going to play their music, and they were going to have a natural audience, like all the bands that they knew on a social level, and all the bands that they looked up to and admired on a sort of a cultural level. Right? I think bands like Pearl Jam were primarily about success in some way. Like those bands, the sort of mainstream grunge bands, right, existed to exploit an audience that was created by the bands with a more legitimate entry into the public consciousness. You know, the only way that I can describe it is just that, like, there are bands that are bands primarily, and along the way may get famous, and then there are bands composed of people who want to be famous and want to be successful, and if they need a band to do it, then that's okay. And that's the difference culturally between the types of people or the types of bands that we're talking about.
Cool. You mentioned the audience, and I want to ask you about that. I mean, where did you see the audience coming from for bands like Nirvana, for the bands we're talking about that came out of Seattle? Was it the same? Was it a distinctly different audience than what we had seen gravitating towards the whole 80s metal thing? Or do you think that there was a lot of crossover happening?
Well, the whole 80s metal scene was extremely localized into Los Angeles and Hollywood specifically until there started to be MTV videos and more sort of television presentation of this cartoonish imagery, right? Then that developed a kind of a copycat effect in other cities, and those bands started to develop an audience from the top down, from like mass culture exposure down to the street level. That's where those bands developed their audience. The independent rock bands of the era developed their audience in a much more grassroots manner. That is, there was no radio play, there was no television, there were no videos, the records weren't distributed particularly widely. Everything was available on independent record shops. You'd occasionally hear them on college radio, and they would play in the smaller clubs, the independent clubs, not the corporate clubs. They were generally playing to an audience of their peers. Like when a band like Scratch Acid or Nirvana or Killdozer or the Melvins played in any town, the audience would be primarily composed of either people in bands or people who identified with people in bands from that scene. You wouldn't see like a mainstream audience because they wouldn't be playing in a mainstream venue. Like they wouldn't be playing in an oyster bar. They would be playing in a grubby punk rock bar, right?
Right.
So the touring cycles for bands like that tended to be sustainable and gradually building an interest in all those bands. But primarily it was about survival. It was primarily about make enough money on this show to get to the next show, make enough money on the tour as a whole to last you until you did your next tour. A lot of the sort of more spectacular showpiece heavy metal bands, their touring was mostly publicity, and a lot of it was underwritten, either by management people or by record label people. And they were kind of expected to lose money, you know. And that implies an outside investment. And the outside investment implies people with leverage on the band and considerable money at their disposal. So those bands always had fancy equipment. They always toured under nice working conditions. Yeah, they always stayed in nice hotels. They played in the corporate venues and the more mainstream mass culture places. And the underground bands would sleep on people's living room floors. They would play house shows in people's basements. They would, live on ramen noodles.
Yeah. I guess with the impact of MTV, as you're saying, and with radio, speaking of the audience, I mean, I guess the audience was getting harder and harder to define for heavy metal because it had become so mass level. I mean, the jocks were there now.
Yeah.
The popular people were there now. And maybe to some extent that, whether it was conscious or not, it set up the emergence of something that was going to reconnect with people who didn't connect with all those, the guys that used to beat them up in the hallway.
Yeah, the thing about the differences in the audiences between the heavy metal bands and the underground bands was that the underground band audience included some people with heavy metal sympathies. The heavy metal audience did not include anybody that had sympathies for the underground and the punk rock scene. So there were some people who either ironically or just because of Catholic tastes in the underground scene and in the punk scene also liked some of this like pop metal stuff. I can think of a few examples in my own peer group, right? I can't think of anybody I knew that was into the kind of flashy, showy heavy metal that was also into like the noisy, grunty end of the underground scene. Like I literally can't think of a single example. There may have been one somewhere, but I can't think of one.
Very confused individual.
Because the bands presented such different images to their audience, you can understand why the audiences would be so completely disparate, right? And when Nirvana made it onto the radio, and the general public got to hear a simpler, more organic presentation of a rock band that was pretty self-confident, I think people who may have had some reservation about the phoniness of the heavy metal world, but wouldn't identify it as such, just reacted and responded a little more warmly to something that seemed a little bit closer to the bone, a little bit more legitimate. And I can't, I'm very bad at figuring out why people like what they like. I'm also notoriously bad at figuring out whether or not anybody will like something. Whenever I'm asked my opinion by a band, like which of these two songs should we put first on the record, I'm always stumped. And if I ever express an opinion, it's generally pretty bad. It's generally wrong, So I can't deduce from my experience and my exposure to these musics why people liked what they did. I'm just purely speculating. Is that people who'd only seen the sort of mainstream pop, heavy metal type music, when they got a chance to hear something more legitimate in the same context, something that was presented to them as legitimate, it wasn't something that this lower caste of people was doing in some scummy environment that they would never go into. It was on their regular radio, or it was on their regular television. When they got a chance to see something like that, they just responded to it intuitively, rather than anybody having figured out in advance. So I can't wait until something more earnest comes along.
Yeah. Lyrically speaking, given that we've been talking about metal being either about the party, or maybe about metaphysics, or maybe about dragons, or themes that are larger than life, was there anything distinctly unmetal about a band like Nirvana from a lyrical standpoint? Because based on just my superficial understanding of Nirvana, is they weren't singing about any of those things. So is it fair to say that was another element that was separating them from the heavy metal pack?
Well, I think it's fair to say that people who like heavy metal music are tolerant of a certain range of themes in the music. Generally speaking, the protagonist in heavy metal music is not the victim, and is not in a position of submission, and is not in any way doubting himself. Right? There's a sort of a headstrong confidence presented in all of the themes of heavy metal music, whether it's dominance or violence or, spooky ghosts, whatever it is. You don't see passive roles, and you don't see people who are subject to conditions outside of their control in heavy metal music, right? Now, that changed a little bit when some of the thrash metal bands started to get more abstract and wanted to start to distance themselves from the pop metal people, wanted to create a kind of an intellectual leap between some of the nerdier thrash metal bands and the sort of populist party hairspray bands. I understand the distinction there, but I also don't think that your average person gives a shit what the lyrics on a song he likes are. I think the themes sometimes can peek through and resonate without anybody actually literally knowing what all the words are. And in a lot of cases, people sing along with songs that they identify with on a sort of a amusement level, rather than that they identify with because it's telling their story, Right. So I don't think you can put too much emphasis on the lyrics. I don't think you can put too much emphasis on the subject matter. But there is a distinction between the two camps. Like, you can tell that they're singing about different stuff and for different reasons.
Yeah. But maybe, as you say, you're sort of telegraphed that message already just by virtue of it's a Kurt Cobain and it's not a Ronnie James Dio.
Sure.
It's sort of standing there and barking at you. You're being told implicitly that this is coming from a different place.
I think, if nothing else, the underground music of the era seemed like people were being honest to each other. Like, not just honest in the sense of true stories in the lyrics or whatever, but the music wasn't presenting a phony image or a facade of an invented persona, right? Whereas I don't think there was anything about heavy metal that was intended to be read as 100% legitimately true. It was pretty much all meant to be fantastic, from the sound of the records to the way people dressed to the way the music was presented. You know, everything was intended to be fantastic, larger than life, unrealistic. Whereas in the punk tradition and the underground tradition, bands were expecting their audience to identify with them on a real level. Like, this is really me standing here singing to you something that I genuinely mean. And I think that's probably the principal sort of philosophical difference between the two camps.
You're not standing there channeling the energy of Thor.
Right, sure, yeah.
Or something. What you mentioned earlier on, I think, was quite interesting in that, to the extent that any of these Seattle bands were referencing or sounding like metal, was coming from a much earlier generation. It was, if anything, it was the Sabbaths and that era of metal. If there was any DNA, as you put it, in that sound, it's sort of like a leapfrogging. And you know, since then there had been sort of 2 decades of, you know, Aerosmith and Kiss and Iron Maiden and Judas Priest and then Motley Crue and then Poison and so on, as we've been talking about. But I'm wondering, what is striking, and maybe it's because of the climate of the time and the bloatedness of metal, you never heard the guys in Seattle at that time, it seemed to me, discussing those metal influences, if they were there. It was almost like metal had become taboo, and I wanted to get your thoughts as to how that was happening and why that was happening.
Yeah, I mean, I think within the community of musicians, like within the peer group of musicians, heavy metal had progressed into this sort of an ugly caricature, and if you weren't part of it, your first instinct was to make fun of it and to dismiss it because it was this fantastic, phony bullshit with a long tradition of fantastic, phony bullshit, right? At its roots, there were some amazing things. There were bands like AC/DC and Black Sabbath and even bands like Blue Cheer and ZZ Top, who are not specifically identifiable as metal, but could be seen, like their DNA could be seen in heavy metal bands, right? So the stuff that was legitimate, that were kind of the precursors of metal, or that were the stalwart metal bands that remained awesome, right? That stuff informed all of the music of all of the underground bands of the era, right? But it wasn't necessarily something that people would cop to for fear of being identified with, fear is the wrong word, but for not wanting to misrepresent yourself as being part of this slutty, ugly, like grasping, needy, attention whore metal stuff, the hair metal stuff, and all the other like yodeling high octave metal that we all thought, from, I say we, meaning people, my peers in the punk scene, we were embarrassed by that. Like, if your aunt found out you were in a band, you would be petrified that she might think you were in a band like Whitesnake, you know? So that's kind of where that comes from. It's, you don't want to be associated with the stuff that you think is stupid and retrograde and phony, but at its core, some of that stupid, retrograde, phony stuff comes from things that had a kernel of greatness and individuality and distinction, and those things were still part of the aesthetic of all the underground bands of the era.
And perhaps also, you know, taking an even more cynical view of this, if we think about the media probably had very little interest in positioning the Seattle sound as being connected to heavy metal because they needed something new too.
Yeah, there was a narrative that was...
Even though Chris Cornell was listening to Black Sabbath, or even though, you know, Kurt may have been listening to Blue Cheer and these sorts of things.
Well, there was at the time there was a kind of an aphorism, which is that the Seattle sound was the synthesis of Black Flag and Black Sabbath, right? And I think that that's not miles away from true. Black Sabbath had the sort of detuned, ugly, sludgy quality. Black Flag had the nihilism and the self-loathing and that sort of thing. So I don't think that's miles away from the truth. At the time, though, there was a narrative that was created by the popular media that grunge music was in opposition to heavy metal, and so any tenuous links between them wouldn't have been recognized, like wouldn't have been identified. And as a participant in the music scene of the day, I knew that there was some influence between older heavy metal music and the contemporary underground scene. It wasn't something that anybody really felt they needed to play up in that world. Because I think the differences between those two camps were much more important than the similarities. You know.
Interesting. It's like these bands were actually reclaiming something which at the time was really unpopular to reclaim because this term heavy metal had such a horrid taste in people's mouths. Now to go and reclaim Sabbath or, you know, Uriah Heep or Wishbone Ash or the more obscure band you can pull out now, the cooler you are. Like, it has currency again, but at that time it was almost like, forget about it.
But the other thing is that a lot of these older bands that are now once again in vogue, like, you know, you can admit to being a Budgie fan now, whereas if you admitted to being a Budgie fan in the late 80s or early 90s, you would be identified as a heavy metal nerd, and then you'd be suspect, I suppose. But a lot of that comes from the way this music, that the older, simpler heavy metal has been sort of validated by its influence on other contemporary bands. And I think the sort of rediscovery of these historic bands like Pentagram and Budgie and all of these other early hard rock and heavy metal bands, the rediscovery of those bands by a new audience is probably more to do with the fact that they are cross-culturally identified as awesome now. It's not just heavy metal people that are into bands like Budgie and ZZ Top and AC/DC. It's, you know, punk bands and underground bands and even like some of the like noisier techno and electronic people identify with some of this like really simple early heavy metal stuff.
And back to that particular time, you know, the shift from the 80s to the 90s, I mean, perhaps this whole oppositional character between what was happening in Seattle and what was happening in Los Angeles is embodied in Nirvana's refusal to tour with Guns N' Roses, which is kind of a telling, you know, if you could almost fly in back to that time and sort of pick a moment that seems to somehow characterize a split.
I don't actually know what you're talking about. I'll assume that Guns N' Roses offered to have Nirvana tour with them. I'll assume that that's true. I don't have any firsthand knowledge of that. But Guns N' Roses were a pretty good example of a band that, like, they made my blood boil when I was, and part of it was there were a few apologists for Guns N' Roses in the music scene that I was part of. I can think of one woman in particular who was really fond of Guns N' Roses. Otherwise, she had impeccable taste, and it was baffling to me. It was baffling and a little bit unsettling to me that music that stupid and that bad could appeal to someone who otherwise had impeccable taste. So, I think that's a pretty good schism, but a pretty good breaking point between the two idioms. I mean, I think that also sort of plays toward the notion that these mainstream pop metal bands, they were looking for an edge, looking for an angle at sort of every point, like trying to find a way to promote themselves, trying to create publicity, trying to create attention. Again, sort of pushing the image to the forefront and the wanting to be thought of as being important rather than doing something that was of itself worthy of being considered important. And I guess by trying to associate themselves with this younger, more cutting-edge band, they thought that they would be sort of absorbing some of that critical cachet.
Yeah.
Is that the right word even? Critical.
Sounds good.
What do you mean by that?
Last area I want to talk with you is what happens after this so-called triple quotation word grunge dies. This show is called Metal Evolution.
Right.
So it's sort of, we're invested in the concept that nothing ever actually really completely ever dies.
Yeah.
In the sense that it all goes somewhere. Because some kid is sitting in their bedroom with their first guitar listening to a Soundgarden record or listening to a Pearl Jam record going, wow, maybe I can do this one day. And I actually wanted to ask you about the sort of mid-90s era, particularly Bush, who you worked with briefly. In the from our observation, there seems to be this evolution in the 90s whereby music that is influenced by grunge to some extent becomes increasingly palatable, becomes very radio ready, and a bit and palatable.
Yeah, I understand.
I wanted to get your thoughts on that era, that next sort of era of rock music.
Yeah, I mean, in any era of music, there are those bands that are at the front of the sort of the front of the pack in terms of public acceptance and attention, and then assuming that there's a community of musicians that are sort of familiar with each other, there are always those bands that are looked at as the leading lights within that idiom, like the people who are breaking ground, doing cool stuff that all the other bands of that era, if not emulate, are at least conscious of and respectful of, right? In the 90s, Nirvana probably felt like they were subordinate to bands like the Melvins and the Jesus Lizard and other bands that had been inspirational to them, that were still active or that were at the peak of their powers, right? I don't think that's going too far to say that Nirvana looked up to those bands, right? Nirvana were at the forefront of the group in terms of public attention, and they were certainly, part of that community, and they were respected collaterally by all of their peers. But as Nirvana became more influential to people who were ignorant of these other bands, the bands that Nirvana themselves would have been influenced by and would have been respectful of, then the roots of Nirvana's inspiration became diluted, and the superficial aspects of Nirvana's sound started to be mimicked by other people. Started to become just part of the vocabulary, the whole clean, scratchy guitar hitting the Boss overdrive pedal, becoming the big fuzzy guitar. That move became a kind of a stock part of the vocabulary of a lot of bands, some of whom have culturally nothing to do with Nirvana, who don't come from an underground tradition or even necessarily an intellectual tradition at all. Just that superficial aspect could be mimicked, right?
Yeah.
Once that stuff enters the lexicon, it's then beholden on whoever picks those tools up on a later date to do something of substance with them, rather than counting on the association with the historical antecedent to do all the work, right? I did a record with a band called Bush from England, who were roundly criticized in the US for being imitative of Nirvana. Now, I worked with both bands. I got to see both bands in action. I don't think there was nearly as much similarity between the two in terms of sonic character as everyone else does. I think they had some similar moves, but I also know a little something from behind the scenes, which makes me think that it's because they shared influences rather than because Bush were particularly mimicking Nirvana. And in particular, I know Nirvana were, or Kurt Kurt Cobain specifically, was a big fan of the band the Pixies. And the Pixies did have a lot of this quiet to loud dynamic in their music. And getting to know the band Bush and working with them in the studio, I could tell that a lot of Bush's similarity to Nirvana boils down to them also emulating the Pixies in certain moments. So I think that's an instance of shared influence rather than mimicry. Now, I've also recorded about 1,000 bands who were just baldly mimicking Nirvana, and I have no, I have no illusions about that. Like there were clearly bands that simply just picked up a stylistic identity that was, we're going to sound like Nirvana. I totally understand that. It's totally legitimate criticism. I don't think it's entirely warranted in the case of Bush.
And given, as you know, I mean, that a lot of commentators were running around calling bands like Bush or Candlebox or Silverchair as being these so-called grunge light bands. I mean, did you get, and given that you had come from this underground punk movement and the kinds of bands you would work with in the past, did you come under fire for working with a band like Bush? Was it seen as being, what's ALBINI done now?
Yeah, I mean, people that weren't familiar with the band or only sort of glancingly familiar with the band were dismissive of them, and then by association would be dismissive of me, and I totally understand that, and it doesn't particularly bother me. But I don't have the luxury of ignorance. I actually know the people involved, and I actually know the circumstances of their success. So I have a degree of respect for Bush that people who don't know them and aren't familiar with them wouldn't have. I know that, for example, they did 3 complete circuit tours of North America before any radio station started playing their record. And they got famous the old-fashioned way, by having people like them, by busting their balls, playing. First time through, they played to 50 people. Second time through, they played to 200 people. Third time through, they played to 1,000 people. Like, they busted their balls, they worked really hard, and people liked their record. Okay, I can't find any fault with that. That seems like a totally legitimate way to become super famous. All right? And if you contrast that with a band that was manufactured out of component parts, granted a record deal because of a business relationship between a lawyer and an agency and a record label, and then inserted into the music scene in a way that they were preordained to have an audience. I think it's a completely different way to conduct a career, and I think that is dubious, and that and some of the other bands that you're talking about did behave that way.
So is it fair to say that these bands, the Candleboxes and the Silverchairs of the world, that these bands, I mean, that the primary reason for their quite immediate and meteoric rise to success very early in their career was due to the groundwork that had been laid by the Seattle bands?
But I think just intuitively, I think people like what they like, A couple of different bands were mentioned as being this next generation sort of fake grunge, right? Candlebox. I think it's totally legitimate to call them a next generation fake grunge band, right? A bullshit band with a superficial identity that was insinuated into the music scene and sort of forced onto an audience which tolerated them for a while and then forgot about them, okay? I think that's a legitimate criticism. The band Silverchair were a bunch of high school kids that had a garage band, and they made a demo tape and sent it to their local radio station, and people heard it and liked it. And then they got a record deal, and then suddenly they're touring the world. They're teenagers. They have no grounding in, like, how a musician earns his stripes or anything like that. That sort of happened to them. I can't fault teenagers that have something like that happen to them. I can't, you know, I don't think that that was grasping or aspirational on their part. I think they were just kids playing around, you know. But there was an institutionalized aesthetic of grunge that was clearly applied to a lot of bands. Like bar bands adopted that identity in the hopes that they would get successful or whatever. And, you know, having seen a lot of these bands build their audience from the ground up and sort of suffer through living conditions appropriate with a band that nobody likes yet, yeah, it's a little galling to see somebody who's just sort of granted a career based on the fact that they, you know, they've adopted someone else's sound. It's a little galling. It's hardly the same as having people come with machetes and chop your arms off, you know. I mean, that's a real tragedy.
And as you know, I mean, a key defining characteristic not only of these bands, but even if we look forward to arguably what is the sort of next generation of grunge bands like Creed, to some extent Nickelback, all of these sort of very unpopular bands in the sort of critical realm.
Yeah, patently bullshit bands, yeah.
Right, but hugely successful.
Yeah.
That what Jack Endino calls the Jarl, of course, is a central vocal characteristic.
The foghorn leghorn vocal technique. I'll tell you, boy, go away, boy, you bother me, you know.
Why is the Jarl just so pervasive?
Because it's easy.
Yeah.
It's way easier to sing like Foghorn Leghorn than it is to learn conventional vocal technique to sing in a pretty style or to develop your own personal delivery. It's much, much easier to take something that can be mimicked and warped to your own, like, to whatever your own limitations are. It's like Dick Van Dyke's British accent from Mary Poppins, you know. Anybody can do it that bad. And if he can get away with it, well, then I can get away with it, you know?
Is it fair to argue that these bands I mentioned, like Nickelback and Creed, are the sort of the residual, you know, the bands that have the residue of the grunge sound in their own music?
Bands like Nickelback and Creed and all the other, like the whole unloading of the music industry sewers into this idiom, right? All of that stuff wouldn't exist if there weren't some bands that people genuinely identified with and that resonated with people in the grunge idiom. But they have nothing to do with them. Culturally, you know, like the Christian crybaby grunge, contemporary grunge music, that has nothing to do culturally or in terms of identity with the legitimate bands from the underground that inspired them, right? I don't actually know that they did inspire them. I think they just recognized it as a vocabulary that they could adopt as a means, as a vehicle, as a means, as a tool toward some personal satisfaction or some personal aggrandizement, right? I don't think those bands are part of this tradition in any sense. I don't think they're a legitimate outgrowth of the grunge bands. I think they are a wart that has a tumor that has grown from the cells, the organic, like the healthy cells of the music scene that created these underground bands, has metastasized into like an ugly, like unresponsive to radiation type tumor of Christian Jarl grunge, okay?
Well, the interesting thing is when I talked to Ron Berman from Roadrunner Records, who signed Nickelback, not only transformed the label because of that, but obviously transformed Nickelback. Because the first time he saw them in Alberta, in southern Alberta, you know, they looked like the younger version of somewhere between Pearl Jam and Alice in Chains. And yet I sat down with Chad Kroeger and asked him about this, and he refuses to acknowledge, at least on camera, that they were copying to the grunge thing at all.
Who's Chad Kroeger? Dude from Nickelback?
Yeah.
Okay.
That's great.
I believe you.
Yeah, you're going to have to take my word
I'll
on
take
that.
your word
He is
for
the
it.
singer of Nickelback.
Yeah, I believe you.
So there's this fascinating dichotomy. Like the label guys saw it in the early days. It's like, yeah, that's where those guys are coming from, but they got something. I'm excited, and I think I want to sign this band and do something with them. Chad Kroeger is sort of sitting there going, I'm not going to really let you lump me in with these bands. So
because being associated with all these super famous and successful bands would be so bad as opposed to being a joke, like, say, Nickelback.
Fair. Last question.
You know what happens if you stick 5 pennies in somebody's ass? You get Nickelback.
Awesome. It's classic rock radio now. Alice in Chains, Soundgarden, Pearl Jam. You turn on classic rock radio, that's what you hear. Soundgarden.
I wouldn't do that.
No.
But yeah. Okay. I'll take your word for it.
This is the final chapter. Yeah. I mean, Soundgarden has played a few reunion shows. Pearl Jam never stopped. Alice in Chains is back out there again with a new singer. What's your take on the relevance or lack thereof or place of these bands today as compared to, 20 years ago?
Well, that a lot of the like 3rd tier and 2nd tier grunge bands are making a living at state fairs and casinos now. It doesn't really affect me because that's not where I look for musical inspiration. Mm-hmm. Like I don't feel like those bands are part of the active community of musicians the way the sort of continuity of the underground scene has allowed a lot of people to survive in the music scene for 20, 30 years, maintaining like active participation every day, right? Mm-hmm. I feel like a lot of the people that I knew 25 years ago in the music scene, the ones that were committed to it and had sort of earnest intentions, a lot of them have stayed involved in music and day to day are still involved in the same sort of growing community of musicians, right? Some people graduate out of the music scene and some people fall out of it through attrition. But the people that stay involved in it have an identity that includes their interrelations with other musicians. I don't get that feeling from these sort of show business grunge bands at all. I don't get the feeling that they're that they're in it for life because it means so much to them. It just seems like it's a lot easier than getting a job, Mm-hmm. That's the impression I'm left with. I don't know how, who knows? Maybe the guys in Nickelback are 100% committed to being in Nickelback. Good for them. Mm-hmm. They've had that going for them for a long time now. Good for them.
Mm-hmm. And with bands like Soundgarden, say, or Alice in Chains, I mean, what do you make of the fact that they're going out there today and playing in front of audiences? Is it strictly tapping into nostalgia? Is it payroll? Is it because people that the musical landscape somehow needs this music again?
Well, since I didn't identify too closely with the sort of professional sphere grunge bands, I don't really know what motivates their audience or the musicians themselves, and I kind of don't want to know. Yeah. I mean, I had the opportunity to dirty my hands with that shit while it was around, and I chose not to, right? So I wasn't interested in it then. I'm not interested in its revival. Doesn't mean anything to me. But on a personal level, for the people in the bands, if you start a band with some friends of yours and you go through the whole life cycle of a band and then call it quits, and then some years later, you and the other guys in the band decide that you want to play some shows again, I don't think anybody else in the world really has anything to say about it. It's like what happens within a marriage. I don't think anybody not in the marriage gets to really pass judgment on how you interact with your wife. Mm-hmm. I don't think anybody not in the band really has any purchase to say something good or bad about how a band conducts itself. Those are all internal band decisions, and I respect bands making those decisions for themselves. Mm-hmm. So the fact that a band revives itself and goes out on the road again after a hiatus, I don't think that's necessarily good or bad. In fact, I think it's something that I shouldn't have an opinion on, because I'm not in the band, But I will admit to not standing in line in the rain waiting to be, first in to see the Creed reunion. It's definitely not going to happen.
Thank you, Steve.
All right.
That was awesome. And can I have your blessing to carry forth the Nickelback joke?
Sure.
Because it's awesome.
Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you.
I actually heard that from a guy from Alberta.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah.
God bless him.
Calgary, Alberta, home of the Caesar cocktail, ginger beef, and one other thing. There's one other thing that came from Calgary.
The mechanical bull? No.
I can't remember what it was.
They perfected
They were
there.
really, really proud of 3 things that were invented in Calgary. Ginger beef, which is this like fried, like crispy beef with Chinese noodles thing. The Caesar cocktail, which sounds like a bowl of puke to me. It's like a Bloody Mary with clam juice.
Right. Maybe the third one's Nickelback.
No. I know that they weren't proud of Nickelback.
Cool.
I can't remember what it was.
Well, thanks, Steve. Appreciate that.